What is up, guys? Welcome to part 3 of the Red Chip Poker GTO Plus course. We're going to be continuing looking at our c-bet in position model. We're also going to discuss basic scripting in this session. Hopefully at this stage you've taken my advice and you've fired up the included GTO Plus tree and had a look at the c-bet model on the King 7-2 rainbow texture for takeaways. In order to assimilate the data here in the most profitable way, what we're really looking for is obvious trends and patterns. If you have a look on the right hand side, we can see the breakdown for each hand type. We have these horizontal bars with a mixture of blue and green, which represent the betting and checking. What is up, guys? Welcome to part 3 of the Red Chip Poker GTO Plus course. We're going to be continuing looking at our c-bet in position model. We're also going to discuss basic scripting in this session. Hopefully at this stage you've taken my advice and you've fired up the included GTO Plus tree and had a look at the c-bet model on the King 7-2 rainbow texture for takeaways. In order to assimilate the data here in the most profitable way, what we're really looking for is obvious trends and patterns. If you have a look on the right hand side, we can see the breakdown for each hand type. We have these horizontal bars with a mixture of blue and green, which represent the betting and checking range. If we have a look at more detail at one of these bars, we can see that the bars range from left to right, where the stronger hands are on the left. So if I were to hover my cursor over top pair, for example, you can see over on the left hand side we're dealing with ace-king type combos, and as we progress towards the right hand side, we're dealing with the top pair with weaker kickers. When the bars are laid out this way, it allows us to spot patterns quickly. And that's really what we're trying to do here, spot overriding trends. We're not too interested in all the individual ups and downs we see. We're interested in overriding trends. And if you look at those bars, there's two of those bars that stand out to me as having an overriding trend. And that is the top pair bar and the ace high bar. If we look in more detail at that top pair bar, we can see that there's clearly more blue over to the left-hand side and clearly more green over to the right-hand side. We've spotted one overall trend there. Also, if we look at ace high, we see something similar going on here. Towards the stronger ace highs, we see lots of green over on the left-hand side of the bar, whereas on the right-hand side of the ace high bar, we see lots of blue. Pocket pair below top card seems to follow a similar trend. And middle pair also seems to follow a trend as well, where there's more blue over on the left-hand side and more green on the right-hand side of the bar. So let's have a look at the ace high and figure out what this actually means when we spot a trend like this. So essentially, the stronger ace high type hands on the King 7-2 rainbow texture are checks. So with an ace high type hand on this texture, we can see that showdown value is relevant on the flop, according to our GTO model based on the given game tree. As we get towards the weaker ace-x holdings, for example, ace-5, ace-6, we can see that these hands are sometimes bet, but the further we progress towards the weaker ace-x showdown value, the more these hands become bets instead of checks. Might be to do with the fact that ace-queen high has an easier time defending against a bet on the turn from our opponent after we check back the flop. If we now have a look at the top pair category, we can see that the stronger top pairs are nearly always bet, whereas the weaker top pairs are nearly always checked. Once we get to the mid-range top pairs, those often end up around 50-50 split. If you have a look on the left-hand side, those king 10 combos, we can see the actual split that's being recommended there. For example, if you look at that first king 10 offsuit combo, the king of spades, 10 of diamonds, you can see that we have 0.458 as a bet, and 0.542 as a check. In other words, bet 45% of the time and check 55% of the time. So roughly 50-50 split. If you look at the whole cards grid, you can see the pattern quite clearly. So we have more green towards the king 8 offsuit, king 9 offsuit, and then we just have clear blue at the king queen offsuit, ace king, etc. There is some mixing with some of the stronger combos. You can see, for example, ace king offsuit gets mixed into the check back range with some frequency. But generally there's a really clear trend towards betting the higher kickers and checking back the weaker kickers based on this GTO model. If we look at mid pair, so that's a pair of sevens, we see similar things going on where we are more likely to bet the pair of sevens with the ace kicker, quite likely to bet the pair of sevens with the queen kicker, but when we get down to 9-7 and 7-8, we're more likely to put those combos in our checking range. Now this is just one flop texture, the King 7-2. The rules of playing on this texture could conceivably be quite different from the rules of playing on a more connected texture. So the next recommended option for you at this stage is to run the same tree, but with a different flop texture. So let's just go through the procedure for running that. We need to change the board and then rebuild the tree. So let's do that. King 7-2, let's pick something that is more connected. Let's go for a 10-9-5 texture. We expect this board to be better for the big blind cold caller, which means as the button aggressor, we're not going to be able to c-bet as aggressively on this texture. Let's go to done. Now you notice if we click run solver that we get this error message. Changes have been made. The reason why we get this message is that GTO Plus considers the flop texture as part of the tree. And if we just choose solve current tree, we're not going to get this tree based on the 10-9-5 texture. We're going to get this tree based on our previous texture, the King 7-2. We don't want that. We want our new board texture as part of the tree, so we need to choose the rebuild tree option. Now, so long as the settings are exactly the same as they were previously, then we're going to get exactly the same tree. The only difference is that we're going to get the different board texture, which is what we want. So let's choose build tree in this case. It tells us building this new tree will delete the previous one. That's fine. This tree is going to be the same anyway. It's just going to have the new flop texture. Tree has been successfully built. Now at this stage, we can run the solver. And same setup as before. We want to make sure that we select the appropriate amount of threads, storage, and target DEV. We're just going to leave the current settings in place right now and run the solver. So the solver's run. It took 41.34 seconds. Let's have a look at that c-bet range on the flop, which is now the 10-9-5 two-tone texture. Once again, if we look over on the right-hand side at the bars, we can get a feel for whether there are any overall trends that we want to be aware of. One thing that jumps out to me straight away is that there is not a lot of slow playing that happens in the top regions. For example, if we have a look at sets, that's almost all blue, with the very occasional slow play. If we have a look at two pair, same kind of thing. These hands are very occasionally checked back, but the overwhelming majority of the time these hands are bets. Same with overpairs as well. It says we can sometimes check back aces in this spot, but all of the other overpairs are 100% bets in this situation. So we're possibly seeing the concept of vulnerability come into play here again. Obviously, when we check back something like queens or jacks, it's far more likely to be outdrawn by our opponent's overcards, whereas aces, okay, yes, it's somewhat vulnerable to things like straight draws and flush draws, which is why it's still bets at a higher frequency, but it's obviously less vulnerable to overcards because there aren't any overcards that can outdraw pocket aces at this stage. Looking at top pair, middle pair, and weak pair, these are all checked at a high frequency, but we can see that top pair bets more frequently than middle pair and weak pair. Seems to make sense on a very basic level. When you look at that ace high and no made hand category on this kind of texture, it might be a good idea to just ignore those two bars because the ace high and no made hand categories are made up of a variety of different draws and non-draws. And you can see the breakdown beneath. We have flush draw, OESD, gut shots, overcards, and two card backdoor flush draw. So it might be a better idea to use those categories to look for trends rather than trying to find a trend in the ace high category, because the ace high category is going to include some hands with flush draws, some ace high without flush draws, etc. No made hand is also going to include things like OESDs, gut shots. It can be confusing trying to analyze all of those different hands at once. So it makes sense to break it down by flush draw, OESD, gut shot, overcards, and two card backdoor flush draw. When we have a look at flush draw and OESD, we can see that they all bet at a high frequency. We can see that is mostly blue when we look at those two bars there, and sometimes green. A logical question to ask is which OESDs bet the most, which OESDs check the most. So let's have a look at the OESD breakdown here and see if we can spot a pattern. So we can see combos like Queen Jack seem to bet at a very high frequency. If we scroll along to the right hand side to find those combos that are checking at a higher frequency, we're seeing things like 7-8 and Jack-8. Well, it should hopefully make sense on a basic level that those combos are not going to bet as aggressively because they are dominated OESDs. So we actually see a tendency to bet the nut draws more aggressively and the non-nut draws less aggressively. They're checking a bit more often. However, because it's a GTO/balanced strategy, we see that even the weak OESDs are still mixed. So when we have something like 7-8, yes, the solver's checking more, but it's still mixing that hand into the betting range with some frequency. When we look at gut shot, we see this pattern is even more clearly defined. So the only combos that are pure 100% bets are actually the combo draws, things like king, queen of clubs, etc. Hands like king, queen offsuit bet at a very high frequency, whereas at the other end of the spectrum we have holdings like jack 7, 6-7, and queen 8 that check with a much higher frequency, but even those combos still sometimes bet with a low frequency. If we look right at the low end of the spectrum there, we have a holding like 6-7 of hearts. Yes, it checks 77% of the time, but because this is a balanced strategy, it also bets 23% at the time. So even though the betting frequency is low, it still bets at some frequency. So my recommendation is to take some time to explore this model, perhaps even try a different flop texture and explore it. We're actually going to take a look at a slightly different, less complex overall metric, and that is our c-bet frequency on certain textures. Generally speaking, one of the important ways of maximizing efficiency with solver use is to start with the broader trends and then work inwards. You don't just want to immediately zone in on one specific combo and try and figure out the intricacies of how to play that combo. Because although you will play quite well if you're ever in that situation with that specific combo, you've only actually improved your overall game by a very small amount. We're going to make some very broad brush strokes right now and hopefully make some sweeping improvements to the way that you think about c-betting on various flop textures. If we take a look at the top where we can see the game tree, we have our c-bet frequency given this certain sizing. So right now GTO Plus is recommending a 46.2% c-bet frequency in this spot. A logical question to ask is, well, that's our c-bet frequency for this texture. What should our c-bet frequency look like for different board textures? If we could maybe choose a selection of 10 or 20 different flop textures and figure out what our overall stance should be in terms of c-betting aggression on those boards. Now, one way to do this is to simply enter different board textures, rebuild the tree, and then manually take a note of the c-bet frequency. That's going to work fine, but it's going to take quite a bit of time. If only there was a way to script this so that we could come back to our computer in a couple of hours and we would have 20 flops solved for us. Well, there is a way of doing this. Now, before we script for different flop textures, let's see if we can make some optimizations for our game tree. At the moment, you can see that the player out of position on the flop is given the option to donk bet. Now, while it is GTO correct, if we're realistic here, most players don't donk bet the flop. They generally check to the PFR. We're actually going to get a clearer picture of what we should be doing in theory with our flop c-betting strategy if we remove the option to donk bet from the tree. So let's go to edit tree. Let's see how we can do that. We'll import the current tree, and we can see at the first decision node, player 1, the out of position player, has the option to either donk bet for 4 big blinds or to check. We want to completely remove that option to bet 4 big blinds. If we click on that decision node, it's very simply a case of clicking the red cross here and we can remove that whole section of the game tree. Not only will this be increasing the accuracy of the output, but it's also decreasing the size of the tree, which means a faster solve. You can see in the top right, memory needed for solving 630 megabytes. Before we made this change, it was around 900. So we've literally decreased the size of our tree by roughly 33% in this case. Once we've made the changes to our game tree, we can choose accept changes and they should get transferred over to the main tree. It says accept, edited tree, confirm. If we now look at the top left, we can see that the first decision node, the player OOP, only has the option to check. Now let's think how we can script this tree to run for various different flop textures. We're going to go to the Run Solver option, and we're going to choose the Advanced option. We're then going to check Activate Database Mode. If we look over on the right-hand side where it says Database, it currently says 0 trees, 0 solved. So it's here we can input the different flop textures that we'd like to solve for. If you'd like the Quick Start version, you can simply fill in a value for this Add X Random Flops. For example, if I type 20 and then choose add X random flops, you can see that it's populated with a list of 20 different flop textures which we can solve for. Now, although that's the fastest option, it's not necessarily the most accurate option. We really want a nice range of different flop textures which we feel are representative of the main situations that we face as poker players. And it's probably worth constructing your list of flop textures by hand. We have this option here, import flops from file. Now you can see input already is myflops.txt, which is a file that I created in the GTO Plus directory. To give you a rough idea, this will probably be on your C drive, it's S drive in my case, program files, GTO, which is the main GTO directory, and then flops folder. You can see we have this myflops.txt. Let's just have a look at how that file is constructed. It's very simply a list of flop textures, each on a new line. GTO Plus is going to be able to read this file. Now we've gone for a nice mixture of different flop textures. So we have some of the high card that are dry, like Ace-7-2 Rainbow, some with multiple broadways, Ace-King Queen, King High Dry, Queen High Monotone, 10 Jack Deuce, so a little bit more connected. I would refer to that as a dynamic two-tone texture. 7-8-9, so heavily connected with a straight, already possible. Low texture, 7 Deuce 3, King King Deuce, which is paired dry. Jack Jack 9, paired dynamic texture. Queen 10-7, mid-range dynamic texture. And Ace Ace Deuce, again, that's another paired dry texture. You can see we have a nice selection of boards here. The Queen 7 Deuce is a mono board, by the way. We want at least one of those in our analysis. Returning to GTO Plus, if we choose the clear database option, it's going to remove those randomly generated flops. And we can then choose this option, import flops from file. It's obviously going to check the directory where we just were for the file of this name. And you can see it just picks those flop textures from the file and adds them to our list of flops that we're going to iterate over. We can also add our existing tree for a point of reference. So if we choose add current tree, it's going to add the 1095 to the output as well. Well, we're mostly ready to go right now. We can just choose the process database option. Naturally, this is going to take a bit longer than just solving for one tree. So probably a good idea to go away and let's come back when everything's solved. So we can see right now that the tree has been solved. We can tell this from the green check marks by each of the trees. The entire solve here is going to be included in file number 3, CBET imposition multi-flop solve. So if you don't want to run the solve yourself, just open up this file in GTO and you'll have access to the solved trees. We want to get more information on our solves. So let's click on this bar chart icon in the bottom right. Here we see the overall breakdown of all of our solves, so it allows us to compare them directly. If you want to see the individual data, you can simply click on a flop and then head on over to the tree. So you can see we clicked King King Deuce, we then clicked on the tree in the top left. We now have all of the data for playing on this specific texture. We can return at any point by clicking on the display results in graph. We get back to the screen and we have the overall breakdown. At the top we have two tabs, one for player 1, one for player 2. As a recap, player 2 is the in position player, the one who is raising first in on the button right now. This is the data we're interested in because, as we mentioned, we're going to be comparing CBET frequencies for player 2. So let's head on over to the player 2 tab. At the moment, we can just see a list of our trees, so 12 flops, the equity, the range versus range equity on each flop, and the expected value of playing on that flop texture. At the moment, it's sorted by equity, so it allows us to get a feel for which types of board texture we like to see as a player who is raising first in on the button. So you can see right at the top of the list, we have the Ace King Queen at 54.88. One of the trends that we should see relatively quickly is that we like boards with high cards. We also like paired textures. If we look at our top boards, we have the Ace King Queen, 3 broadways texture at the top with 55% equity for our range. Jack Jack 9, paired texture. Ace Ace Deuce, paired dry with a high card. King King Deuce, pretty similar to the Ace Ace Deuce but with the paired king. Queen 10-7 does quite well also. We might think, well, that's getting into the mid-range now, so it's not going to be as good for us. But it still seems to be outperforming the Ace-7-2 in terms of equity, so we might wonder what's going on here in this case. As you look over this data, it makes sense to keep in mind that there are still adjustments we can make to improve the accuracy of our tree. So you see right now, we actually are forcing the solver to always bet 2/3 pot. And we're going to see that when we give the solver the option of using a range of different sizing, it's actually going to be betting different textures with different frequencies. So just keep in mind that not everything is going to be exactly as we expect it to right now, but the picture becomes clearer and clearer as we increase the quality of our tree. And one thing we'll do in the later sessions is we're going to incorporate multiple bet sizings for the solver to make use of. But as we've mentioned so far in the series, we're not looking for small fluctuations in data. We're actually looking for overriding trends as much as possible. And one of the overriding trends you'll see here, especially if you run with a large amount of flops, is that the PFR generally likes textures with a high card. Likes textures with an ace or a king especially. It likes dry textures, and it likes paired dry textures as well. The board textures that the PFR doesn't like as much is going to be the mid-range coordinated textures and the textures that don't have a high card. So maybe they're going to be jack high, 10 high, 9 high. In general, these are not going to be as good for the PFR. They're going to be more favorable for the cold caller. Another lesson we can extract here is looking at our equity versus EV. Now we're sorted by equity, but if you look at EV, it's not actually in order of expectation. It's mostly in order. We definitely have the lower EV values towards the bottom of this list and the higher EV values towards the top of the list. But if we sort by the EV column, we see the order changes. So our EV is actually highest on a king, king, deuce rather than the ace, king, queen. So although our equity is higher on the ace, king, queen, our EV is higher on the king, king, deuce. So another lesson that we can learn here is that equity does not necessarily translate to expected value. There's a playability component to certain ranges on certain textures. Now let's think about our c-bet frequency. If you look at the top above the grid, we actually have a second version of the game tree. So we have our main game tree at the top, which is going to show us the individual strategies for individual holdings. But this second game tree, if we choose check here, we then arrive at the decision node of the c-better in position. We can see has the option to bet for and bet check. If we now have a look at the table over on the right hand side, we can see the betting frequencies on different textures. In fact, let's sort by betting frequency. So we can see on certain textures, we're c-betting very aggressively, whereas on other textures, we're not c-betting aggressively at all. With the current tree, it seems that the king, king, deuce is by far the texture where the highest c-bet frequency is incentivized. You can see 60.77 c-betting frequency on that texture. Ace, ace, deuce does very well. At the bottom of the list, we have ace 7-2, which is perhaps surprising. We might expect that to be a good texture, but again, it could be partly to do with the way that we've set up the tree. 9-8-7, that's one of the textures we would expect to see in the lower c-bet frequency. So here's the challenge after watching this video. We've seen how we can use the scripting system in GTO Plus to analyze betting frequencies for a wide range of different flops. However, we only used 12 flops in this case, which means that we're going to see more fluctuations and we might not experience the best overall trend in this case. So your challenge is to create your own list of flops using the file, perhaps more than this, maybe 20, 30 flops. Use the same tree or even make some alterations. You might want to try this with the donk bet line possible. You might want to try different c-bet sizing to see if we get a clearer trend in terms of which board should be c-bet the most aggressively. Build your tree, run your solve, then spend some time analyzing the data. If you don't want to create your own tree and it seems like a lot of work, then at the very least fire up this pre-solved tree that's been included. You literally just have to go to File, then Open, then select the tree, and start exploring some of this interface. You'll notice that we have this graph here, and at the moment we're seeing the different textures graphed by their c-bet frequency. But we can also sort this by other parameters, for example EV. You'll see each of the flops sorted by EV. We can see each of the flops sorted by their checking frequency, which is going to be the inverse of the betting frequency in this case. This is our entire range, however. We can also sort by specific hands. So for example, if I sort by ace-king, I can see very specifically how this individual combo plays across each of these textures. So we can see, for example, on the mono, ace-king is advised to check with 100% frequency, same with the jack-jack-9, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, on the ace-ace-deuce, the ace-king nearly always bets. We can see 88.11% frequency. It bets quite aggressively on the queen-10-7 also. And on the ace-7-2, it bets about 50% of the time, so that's sometimes checked back with a 50-50 split there. Finally, we have this aggregate data output, which shows us averages across all of the situations. So we have averages by hand, the average equity of aces, etc. We can again see a graph sorted by either equity or EV. We can see a heat map showing us the equity each hand has across this distribution of different flop textures. We can also see our average frequencies. Now, another way you can see averages and utilize the data is if you head back to the entire range. Let's imagine we wanted to use this table for something external. Perhaps you have the ability to run some scripts, or you simply want to put the data into an Excel document. You can actually click this export option here, and we get the data in a copy and paste format. So you can paste that directly into an Excel or some kind of XML document. All right, have fun, guys. Catch you in the next part of the series where we're going to have a look at c-betting the flop out of position.